Morning, afternoon, evening. I'm not sure where everyone's joining from, but it's very lovely to have you all here, and I'm very happy myself to be here and to be leading today's session. So welcome to the Industry We Want deep dive on purchasing practices in the garment and footwear industry. I'm Olivia Windham Stewart. I'm an independent business and human rights specialist and also Deputy Director of the Responsible Contracting Project. I'm stepping in for Karen Diaz, who is the project lead for the Industry We Want, and I'll be leading today's session, and I'm very, very happy to see so many participants joining us today for what I am sure will be a very interesting discussion. So let's begin with a quick walk through today's agenda. We will start with a brief recap of the Industry We Want, just to situate our discussion, and also the Industry We Want's purchasing practices metric for 2023. I'm then going to invite Wilco van Bokhorst, a lead member of the MSI working group on responsible purchasing practices, to share some insights from the common framework for responsible purchasing practices and also the learning and implementation community. And we'll then turn to our panel, which includes these wonderful people that you can see here: Fatima-Zohra Alaoui, Anna Rüchardt. I'm sorry about your pronunciations. It just occurred to me I should have asked everyone the pronunciation for their name in the half an hour we've been sitting together. Nguyen and Wilco van Bokhorst, and their details are there on the slide next to their names. And I will also ask them to introduce themselves so that you have their correct pronunciations. We have both a chat and a Q&A function open, and we do hope to preserve some time at the end to respond to any thoughts or questions that you may have during the session. So please do feel free to use these. And you're also welcome to email us any questions if there's anything you want to dive into in more detail. The email address is info@theindustrywewant.com. So first of all, a quick recap of the Industry We Want. The Industry We Want was born of impatience and frustration with the pace of change in the garment and footwear industry, but also a belief in the industry's potential to transform the lives of garment and footwear workers in a way that has a positive impact on the planet. It was initiated by Fairwear, the Ethical Trading Initiative, and the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to accelerate progress on social, commercial, and environmental issues. And we have benefited hugely from the partnership of many industry experts, some of whom you can see there on the slide, and also widespread industry consultation and input. So I'm sure that many of you here today have been very key participants in that process. So the Industry We Want aims to drive progress across three pillars of the garment and footwear industry: the social, the commercial, and the environmental. And in 2022, the Industry We Want launched an industry dashboard with a specific metric under each of these pillars to measure change. The social metric focuses on the gap between minimum wages and living wages. The commercial metric focuses on purchasing practices, and that's what we'll be looking at today. And the environmental metric focuses on greenhouse gas emissions. Now, data for each of these metrics was first gathered in 2022 and will be updated on an annual basis until 2025 so that we can gauge how the industry is progressing and also ask challenging questions about how to support, stimulate, and scale progress at large. So if you'd like to see a review of our dashboards from 2022 or 2023, or learn more about the metrics and other pillars, please do visit the Industry We Want website and review our previous sessions, which are available there for you to look at. So this session focuses on our purchasing practices metric, which has been devised in collaboration with Better Buying. The metric uses data gathered by the Better Buying Institute's Partnership Index Survey, which is a 12-point annual survey available for all suppliers to rate their buyers' purchasing practices on a scale of 1 to 5, classifying them as either a true partner, a collaborator, or a detractor. The metric allows suppliers to have their voices heard and offers insights into the risks linked to their buyers' purchasing practices. The Industry We Want envisages this annual feedback moment to act as a conversation starter between suppliers and their brand partners so that they can move towards a commercial relationship that embodies shared responsibility. Supplier participation in 2023, very happily, increased substantially compared to 2022, and we had 1,162 suppliers from 54 countries rating 160 buying companies. This is compared to 679 suppliers from 50 countries rating 100 buying companies in 2022. So quite a significant uptick there, which is fantastic to see. A quarter of the ratings were from supplier companies headquartered in China, and there were other large contributions from Bangladesh, Hong Kong, and Turkey. So you can see here that from a potential range of -100 to +100, the overall score was +40, which is 1 point higher than last year. And if we break down the feedback, we can also see that amongst buyers rated, 56% of our overall behaviors were considered those of true partners, 27% were the behaviors of collaborators, and 16% were the behaviors of detractors. And the share of these ratings, the distribution, interestingly stayed roughly the same from 2022. So we're beginning to see some patterns emerging in the industry through this survey. So that's extremely interesting. Now, we will soon dive into a panel discussion to explore some of the issues around supplier feedback and buyer-supplier collaboration. Before doing that, I would like to hand to my friend and colleague Wilco, who will take you through some insights that have been gleaned from the common framework from responsible purchasing practices. So Wilco, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Olivia. Just a quick introduction from my side. I work for Fairer Foundation as a policy and advocacy officer, but today I'll be speaking to you on behalf of the MSI Working Group on Responsible Purchasing Practices, which I will introduce in a second. Olivia already talked about the metric and the importance of changing purchasing practices and ensuring that they are responsible and of course do not negatively impact suppliers and workers. So then the question of course is, what does responsible look like and how can we get there? And today I will talk about 3 lessons we need to learn when improving our purchasing practices. Before I do that, let me first explain more about how we learned these lessons. So about 3 years ago, the ETIs, Fairer Foundation, the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, and the Dutch Agreement on Sustainable Garments and Textiles, all focused on having their members improve their purchasing practices. But there wasn't like a common understanding of what responsible purchasing practices exactly entail. So that is why we formed the MSI Working Group on Responsible Purchasing Practices to align on these practices and draft a framework, which we now call the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices, to create what we call a reference point for the industry. And when drafting it, we incorporated as much as possible the responsible purchasing practices, which SCTI, a collection of manufacturing organizations, has put in their white paper. Now, as you can see here, the framework consists of 5 principles: integration and reporting, equal partnership, collaborative production planning, fair payment terms, and sustainable costing. And these principles are divided into more than 60 groundwork and progress practices, providing brands with the guidance to move up the ladder and continuously improve their purchasing practices. Can we move the slide, one slide? And today, I also want to call on brands and suppliers to work together and actively start using and implementing the common framework, which you can find also on our website. So after we brought out the common framework, we also wanted to work with brands to implement the framework. And that is why we set up a learning and implementation community with 35 of our members from the different MSIs who are committed to improving their purchasing practices. And the community runs for over the course of 2 years, started in October last year, and also involves suppliers. And after more than half a year of implementing, trialing, and learning, we can already speak of 3 important lessons. And for sure, you will think they are very simple, but the truth is that hardly any brand in the industry applies them fully. So this is what we learned together. 1, we need leadership teams, commercial and CSR departments committed to the goal of improving purchasing practices. It needs to be a joint effort. Often we see that human rights due diligence is the responsibility of the CSR department, ensuring they follow up on audit results, overtime, wages, or rather issues at the factory. Almost all CSR teams of the brands in the community struggled to get their buyers on board to move towards more responsible practices. However, purchasing is the responsibility of purchasing departments, and these practices influence the conditions in the factory. Understanding the interest of the different departments within the company and how they can sometimes conflict requires carefully examining these interests and also commitment from leadership teams to change them. To give an example, the CSR team cannot work on improving wages at factories when buyers have KPIs that provide them with higher bonuses when they reach higher margins on their products. And you need leadership teams to make a call on this and change that dynamic. So buy-in of all three departments is crucial. 2, we need to understand our own purchasing practices. It's often not only one person or one department involved in the buying process, but multiple departments. There's design, planning, buying, etc. And we saw that brands often don't have a good and full overview of all their purchasing practices, let alone their impact. So that is why we brought the different departments together within the community to start mapping out their purchasing practices through the procurement cycle mapping exercise to get a better view of how, to get a better overview of how they're buying. And it provided them with a good starting point to understand the impact of their purchasing practices. And if you're interested in this exercise, you can find it also on our website. 3, we need to understand the impact of our purchasing practices, and we simply cannot do that without the involvement of our suppliers. So when you know your own purchasing practices, the next step is to understand and assess how they impact suppliers and workers. And assessing the impact simply cannot be done without the voice of your partners. So that is why we asked the brands to go to their suppliers and start a dialogue on their involvement in improving purchasing practices and in providing feedback to these brands. For example, the Better Buying Partnership Index is very helpful in asking for feedback. However, it is also important that brands don't use the feedback to only discuss it internally and make changes. Communicating the results to suppliers and involving them in designing solutions together is key to make the necessary progress. Because good solutions that work for brands and suppliers can only come through collaboration and by understanding how changes to purchasing practices impact suppliers and workers. So in summary, if brands want to improve their purchasing practices, ensure that leadership teams, commercial departments, and CSR departments work collaboratively and have the same aim of improving purchasing practices. Come together and map out the purchasing practices to understand them. And thirdly, start assessing the impact of purchasing practices with the involvement of your partners and involve them in designing solutions together. And you will see that if you start to apply these lessons, you will move towards more healthy and more equal partnerships in your supply chain. Thanks, Olivia.
Thank you very much, Wilco. Okay, I would like to ask Sophie for 1 minute just to enable the chat, please, which I think in order to do that, you may need to bring down your screen in some way or another, just because people are keen to engage and ask questions. That's it. Perfect. Thank you very much. As Sophie is doing that, I am going to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves because they can pronounce their names perfectly. And I will start with Fatima, and then we will move around Anna, Nguyen, and Wilco, and then we will begin our discussion, which will take us through to the Q&A, and we'll look forward to hearing thoughts and comments from everyone in the audience. So Fatima, over to you.
Thank you, Olivia. So I'm Fatima from the Moroccan Textile and Garment Industries Association in Morocco. I'm the general manager of the association that represents manufacturers in garments and textile in Morocco. And I'm also the co-spokesperson for the Sustainable Terms of Trade initiative that was launched during COVID, and basically also works on improving sustainable buying practices in the industry.
Brilliant, thank you, Fatima. Anna, to you next, please.
Hi, I'm Anna Rüchardt, which is hard to pronounce for non-German speakers. We're based in Germany. I'm representing the brand side of things. Hakro is a German corporate workwear brand in southern Germany, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm head of impact and responsibility, so I'm co-responsible for everything to do with sustainability at Hakro. So not the purchasing team, but we'll talk a little bit about that later too. So happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Anna. I think even Hakro is a little bit hard for non-German speakers to say, but I'm just going to call it Hakro, so I hope everyone's comfortable with that. Nguyen, over to you next, please.
Good afternoon from Hanoi, Vietnam. My name is Nguyen. I'm the country representative of the Dutch Trade Union, CNV, International in Vietnam. I work closely with local stakeholders here to support the implementation of the multi-company collective bargaining agreement process here and to help improve the social dialogue in Vietnam. Very nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Nguyen. Thanks for joining. And Wilco, even though you've been introduced already, why don't you, for completeness sake, also introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, just like I said, my name is Wilco van Bokhorst. I'm based in Amsterdam, working for Fairer Foundation, and also co-drafted the common framework as well, which I think we're very proud of what we have here. So that's good. Yeah.
Thank you, Wilco. It is definitely an extremely useful tool for the industry. Sophie, while we're talking, why don't we bring down the slide so that everyone's faces are up, and I will start to kick off the discussion. I will turn to Fatima and ask Fatima if she could please share some thoughts and insights into the key challenges facing suppliers with regards to purchasing practices in the industry currently.
Thank you, Olivia. From a supplier's perspective, we've been talking a lot and discussing among ourselves in Morocco and outside of Morocco about the challenges that basically arise during COVID and kind of just got more pressing to handle over the past few years. And if we were to talk about three main challenges, I would start, the first one would be the planning, the forecasting of the orders. That's a big challenge, especially since COVID, because basically what we're witnessing is, I like to use this word, some sort of roller coaster of orders. We go from very high peaks to very deep lows in a blink of an eye, and we never know how long the peak is going to last or how long the low is going to last, which makes it very difficult for the manufacturers to actually properly plan production and workers and so on. So that's a really big challenge for manufacturers today. The second challenge would be pricing. I mean, let's face it, we've all seen it and everybody's talking about it. Prices are going down in the industry since COVID. We thought that during COVID, we hit rock bottom, but it appears that we haven't. We're still digging and prices are still going down. And this is very difficult for manufacturers when on the one side, you require for them to be socially sustainable, pay decent jobs, and at the same time, you keep cutting costs. Sometimes in some countries, your buyers actually buying below cost. So this is a big issue that needs to be also addressed today in terms of buying practices. But all of this cannot happen if we don't have a safe environment in which, like Wilco mentioned earlier, manufacturers can express their concerns and say, guys, something is wrong. We need to work together on this. This is a prerequisite even to start solving the two first problems. If you're not able to tell your buyer this is not working, to improve pricing. So it is very important manufacturers can actually express concern in a safe manner, not be afraid of retaliation, because this is what's happening, and raise awareness of the buyers on the problem and then involve them in solving the problems. So that's something that is very important, and that's something that the various initiatives that were mentioned earlier, including the learning and implementation community and so on, are aiming to do, is bringing together buyers and manufacturers in order to discuss the real challenges and work together on how to improve the situation.
Thank you, Fatima. A slight irony there in the fact your line went a bit funny when we were hearing about the difficulties of supplier feedback. But it emphasizes the point, it's not always easy to hear each other. Nevertheless, we did really pick up on your points, which are absolutely critical to understanding and unpicking if we want to address the problems that are facing us in the industry. And I think it's so interesting because, you know, every time you think that the industry might have hit a rock bottom, something else can happen. And you think, actually, that wasn't so bad. This is actually a little bit worse. So we always are facing new challenges and trying to find ways to make sure that we're raising the rock bottom. Anna, just to pick up on Fatima's final point, would you perhaps be able to share some insights on how HACRO is working on communication and collaboration with its suppliers? Because I know you have some very innovative and interesting practices that we could maybe learn from.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely happy to. Fatima, I really liked what you said when you said suppliers need to feel safe to be able to raise concerns. I think for us as a brand, and especially as a workwear brand, a corporate wear brand, it's very important that it's not just about the supplier being able to raise concerns, but that we really entirely base our partnership on eye level, and that we really have co-ownership basically of our business relationship and of our partnerships with our suppliers. We don't even talk of suppliers, we always call them production partners, because that's really what they are for us. So especially when we come to planning, I think it's a little bit helpful maybe to understand some of our context that we operate in at HACRO, because we do have a very unique business model in some senses, I'd say, because we are not in fashion at all. So we have a constant product portfolio. We don't have seasonal collections or anything. So that really allows us to go into planning and production planning, especially with a very long-term view. So we plan probably 6 months at the least in advance. We do very, very much forecasting together with our partners, and also, you know, all that talk about capacities, production planning, placing orders. It's always happening in a very continuous dialogue with our partners. So we ask as much as we tell, I'd say, generally. And the same thing is for pricing. I think it's very important for us that we never dictate prices and that we never set target prices, for instance, but that when we develop new products, especially, we co-develop them together with our partners from the very get-go. And the same thing applies to pricing as well, that we ask our partners at the end of the day, what do you need in order to produce that product? And that's really where we start the dialogue on pricing together, because we want it to be cost covering. It needs to make business sense for our supply chain partners as well as for us. And at the end of the day, I think none of us can earn anything, and no business makes sense if we dictate our partners how their business should be conducted or how their prices should be covered. So that's really crucial for us. Of course, it is a little bit tricky at the end of the day, because you always have to see, in order to have a real, true and equal partnership, you always have to communicate with each other on a constant basis and continuous dialogue. But the willingness to navigate that, I think, is very important. And if both parties come together like that, I think that, at least for us, it's proven very, very successful.
Thanks, Anna. I think that the advice, ask as much as you tell, is just generally good life advice. So not just for the garment industry, but in general, I think it's probably a very good approach. And thanks everyone for using the chat. We will come to your questions at the end of the session, so we're saving time for those. But first of all, I'd like to turn to Nguyen. Nguyen, you're sitting in Hanoi today and you're representing some of the voices from the Vietnamese garment industry. It would be great to hear from you some of the potential barriers that suppliers in Vietnam are facing when they're trying to provide feedback to the industry and really trying to make positive changes.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Olivia. Over the past 2 quarters after COVID, the garment industry of Vietnam experienced the reduction in order and the reduction of pricing of the orders. So this creates huge impact on the worker life, employment and income because of the inflation of the production cost increase. So to maintain the production, the supplier have to cut the wage and benefits for the workers. And I see a big gap between brands perspective and worker perspective, because when I speak with the brands, many brands thought that they did good enough, with the suppliers, complying with the local labor laws. However, when I speak with the workers, most of the workers said that the wage is too low and they cannot live without working overtime. So this is a huge gap. And I think mainly because there is a lack of, what we discussed today, the good purchasing practices that have to make it happen, that to improve the working condition. Because in the case of Vietnam, many suppliers, they do not have the direct contacts with the brands sourcing from their factories. They have to communicate through vendors, middle agents, and even in case they have the direct contacts or partnership with the brands, in most of the cases, the sustainability department and the purchasing department do not share, the same vision or interest. So I think it's very difficult to work on improvement of working conditions with such business model, because you need to build trust with the suppliers, and in order to build trust with them for improvement, you need to give them incentives via purchasing practices, so that they see the benefits of it. Like, if they invest in better working conditions, better wage, better food for the workers, so what gain, what kind of benefit in return if the price continue to reduce, and if they continue to improve the situation, then they become less competitive in comparison with other suppliers. So I think it's very challenging to work on improvement with existing business model. And this have a direct impact on the situation of collective bargaining, social dialogue in Vietnam, because when the suppliers, they are producing below cost, then it's a kind of mission impossible to work on higher wage or reduce working hours. And when I speak with trade unionists on the renewals of the factory level collective bargaining agreement, or the multi company collective bargaining agreement, they all say that it's very challenging to work on better benefits. They can only retain existing benefit, and in some cases they have to reduce the benefit so that the CBA can be renewed. So for me, I think that is the more challenging things to work on with social dialogue situation now here in Vietnam. Thanks.
Thank you, Nguyen. Yes, I have to say it has always struck me when working on collective bargaining and social dialogue issues in production countries, there is very little room in which to maneuver when the pressures that are coming down from buying countries are so severe. I think it's interesting. It is a mission impossible in some cases. So that's really interesting. Now, Fatima, I want to just come back to you to think we have heard very interesting insights about some of the barriers facing suppliers in terms of giving feedback and addressing some of these problems. But there are also new steps being taken. And I think particularly since COVID, there is a new energy and collaboration amongst suppliers to address some of these issues. And I was wondering if you could perhaps share some insights as to what those mechanisms are and what's developing in the industry.
Yes, you're right, Olivia. Many initiatives were put in place, but before going into that, I would just like to go back to what Nguyen said about the case of Vietnam and just say that the business model is pretty much the same anywhere you go. It's not specific to Vietnam or Morocco or other producing countries. Usually what happens is there are there is almost no direct contact or few direct contact between the suppliers and the buyers, unless you're a tier 1 supplier, in which case, yes, you have in front of you the buying department. But if you're a tier 2 or tier 3 or working through a platform, then you're never actually in contact with the buyer. And of course, it makes it more difficult to voice any concern. But even when you are in contact with the buyers, you're in, the brands, you're in contact with the buyers. Like Wilco said earlier, the buyers, their only concern is shorter lead times and fast delivery, and they get bonuses on the margin they get on the products. So if you're going to go to them and tell them, okay, you need to better plan your orders and you need to pay me a fairer price, then obviously they're not going to listen to you. So the person you want to talk to is the sustainability department in the brand. The problem, and it was mentioned earlier, is that they have divergent objectives. So they don't communicate among themselves a lot. And the only feedback you have from the CSR department, when you have one, is when they come and control and audit you. And if you don't pass, then you lose the orders. So it's a bit complicated situation in which it's difficult to actually do something. And what we did, what AMI did and other manufacturing country did, is we know going alone and talking about the problems that we have with the buyers could be dangerous for our members, our manufacturers, because we never know how the brand will react. So we wanted safety in number to protect our manufacturers and try, because there is number, try to move forward and push forward to change the situation. And this is when, for example, the Sustainable Terms of Trade Initiative was created during COVID. STTI is 11 countries, 11 manufacturing countries that joined forces with the International Opera Federation, the support of the GIZ and the Better Buy-in and so on, to talk about these issues and get the ball rolling seriously about the problem, because we can talk about it all we want. If we don't have concrete actions, then we're not moving forward. So we came up with some ideas, like, for example, putting in place an independent arbitration mechanism that would allow suppliers or associations, country associations representing suppliers, to voice the concern about certain brands without being afraid of retaliation. And then that body would take the complaint in an anonymous way and go to the brand and say, okay, hey, we have a problem here. This was brought to our attention. We need to do something about it. So that could be one of the actions or one of the steps that we're trying to take today. And then we have participation initiatives like the Industry Want, like the Learning and Implementation Community, where we have the chance to actually sit around the table with buyers and with sustainability departments to voice the concern and try to find a solution all together, to have them involved and try to find a solution to improve the situation. Because at the end of the day, when I talk to some of my members, manufacturers, what they say, we don't understand why brands have markups of 300% and they only leave us with 6% gross margin, and they expect us to be sustainable, invest, and so on. That's not working. So the thing is, today, what is important for everyone to remember and to understand is that the well-being of the brands is dependent on the well-being of the suppliers. If you kill your suppliers, well, you will eventually die at some point because you won't have suppliers anymore. And this is why we have joint destiny, and we need to work together and find a solution to the issues we're facing today.
Thank you, Fatima. Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? It's like the old philosophical master-slave dialectic, if anyone knows that Hegel. That's kind of where brands and suppliers are these days. But what is encouraging is that even though we do have these very severe problems, I can't imagine some of these initiatives having been in the industry 10 years ago. You know, there is change, there are new things happening, there is progress, there are developments. And I really want to hold on to that. I think that's really, really encouraging. And in that spirit, I'd like to turn to Wilco to also share some of the positive developments that are happening under the auspices of the learning and implementation community. Wilco.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. Yeah, I just want to refer to Fatima, what she's saying, like, I think the power dynamic between the buyer and supplier, that's really important, right? So let's not beat around the bush, that's there. And if you want to have fair and good feedback, you know, you need to start addressing that. We had brands in the community, they said, we send out a survey, you know, we made our own survey, we asked our suppliers to provide feedback, and then we got the feedback and it was all okay, it was just general feedback, but we don't believe it's the actual feedback, it's the real feedback that we want. So the brand is really genuinely interested in obtaining the feedback, but the suppliers are afraid to lose their orders. So one, of course, what you need to do is emphasize, preferably through leadership teams and through the buying department, that irrespective of what type of feedback the suppliers will give, you know, it will not harm basically the relationship, because the brand really wants to have this feedback. So you need to make sure that there is this relationship. You need to make sure that CSR departments, leadership teams, and buying departments are working together. And that's also what we saw with the brands doing at one point, is that they shifted away from the CSR department sending out a survey, but actually getting the buying department and the management as well involved in sending this out and saying, hey, this is important to us as a company, and we want to keep continuing with you irrespective of what type of feedback you give us. And I think that the trust and the long-term relationships are also, of course, clearly key. You know, if there's no trust, if there's no long-term relationship, you also don't get the feedback, of course. So that's also another very important thing. What we also sometimes see is that brands send out a survey and they expect feedback, but it's limited to that in how we involve suppliers. So some of the good examples we've also been seeing is that you involve them in every step of the way. First of all, in the type of methodology that you use to collect the feedback, first and foremost. Secondly, in providing feedback, but thirdly, also in designing solutions. And also communicating the results back, of course. And too often it's limited to, we just do the survey and then we fix it. But if we also see brands now starting to realize, hey, it's very much dependent on what type of feedback does the supplier want to give, and how should they give that feedback? Is that through a survey? Is that through dialogue? Is that through a focus group discussion? So that's very important as well. And I think choosing your method of how suppliers can give feedback is very much dependent, of course, on your supply chain. Anna can tell more, of course, on you know, if you have a few selected suppliers, it's a different approach than when you have 100 suppliers, for example. And then it makes a distinction between surveys, own surveys, dialogue, focus group discussions. But you can also use other HRD, human rights due diligence tools, right? So audit reports, for example, if you have peak seasons, and you can see from the audit reports that during the peak seasons, overtime goes up. Yeah, it's basically kind of easy to conclude that you're causing this or contributing to it. So there are also other tools to collect this feedback. So I think these are some of the key lessons learned to really reach out and start involving suppliers every step of the way to get this feedback and to start improving.
Brilliant, thanks, Wilco. I think that's really, really interesting. Also to be conscious of some of the dynamics that are at play that can affect the feedback, I think is a really important point. Anna, I'd be really keen to hear how you and the team at Hakro ensure that you respond to feedback from suppliers so that it can support positive outcomes for workers as well.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to pick up on Wilco's points right there, because this describes us exactly our setting. Sort of, we have, believe it or not, 11 tier 1 production partners, so very few, which obviously has the effect that we are very, very much dependent on our partners as much as they are dependent on us. So I think that, again, creates a very unique setting, probably. And then, Fatima, you also said it's very important to have direct contact, which has always been very, very important for us, and not just have direct contact between purchasing and our production partners, but also between sustainability teams and purchasing teams, again, picking up of your points. I think this for us has been a huge learning curve, because it really took us on a journey to understanding what direct impact or even indirect impact we have through our own behavior. And I think, especially when it comes to supplier feedback or feedback from our production partners, that this becomes so relevant. Fatima, you spoke about social audits that take place, and either the factory passes it or it doesn't, and depending on that, the business relationship continues or doesn't. At Hakro, we've taken away that sort of tool out of our toolbox entirely. And again, that sort of levels a little bit of the power dynamic, I think, because we say we don't audit in order to audit. We audit because we want an external expert opinion, and we want to know what we in our partnership together can do better. And that also means that, for instance, after an audit report has been sent out, we enter into a remediation process together. And that means that I'm not seeking to, I don't know, to find who's to blame for certain findings in the audit report, for instance, but I'm really asking, as a brand, together with my purchasing team as well, we're asking, hey, is there anything that we can do better in order to avoid these root causes behind these findings to begin with? So it's very much about, it's a learning journey, of course, but it's very much about being equal partners in that sense, that I ask, where can I contribute? What do I have to change about my behavior? Where can I help? Where can I support you with investments, whether that's financially, whether that's time-wise, training-wise, whatever that might be, and whatever that might mean. And really create that sort of safe space where we can talk about what's working and what's not working within our joint partnership, and not making it about putting the finger on someone and putting the blame on someone, because that's really not what it's about. We're co-responsible for our joint development, and that also accounts for everything that is there within our partnership, sustainability-wise, but also dialogue-wise. I think that's very, very important. And Wilco, what you said internally as well, of course, it's super important to work together with colleagues in purchasing. That's also a learning curve for us. Of course, we don't, as a sustainability team, we don't want to be the ones telling our colleagues how to do their job. And of course not, and I can't, because I'm not in purchasing, but simply to have a common understanding of what our joint impact can be, and to really level our communication towards our partners as well, and with our partners as well, is so key to facilitating that process. And I think it builds better relationships, stronger relationships, and in effect, way stronger and more reliable supply chains as well, which is in turn good for business. So, and I don't mind talking about that, because it has to make sense for business. Fatima, again, you said we all have to survive in that scenario if we want to deliver good products as well, and if it has to make sense from a business point of view as well. So yeah, it's an interesting journey.
Thanks, Anna. I'm not in the market for corporate wear, but if I was, I'd get it from Hakro. Maybe we should have Industry We Want merch made by Hakro. Anyway, as an aside, Nguyen, I'd just like to come back to you, because I know from our conversations that there are also some very interesting approaches developing in Vietnam to address the pressures that you've experienced on social dialogue and collective bargaining. So we'd love to also invite you to say a bit more about that, if that's okay.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. So during my introduction, I mentioned that I'm supporting the multi-company collective bargaining process in Vietnam. So for you who are new to this process, it means that several companies in the same sector, like several garment companies in the same district or province, they will come together to sign a collective bargaining agreement with the provision better than the law for the workers. So there are several innovative things about this process. Firstly, production workers and trade unionists at factory level will be trained with legal knowledge and with social dialogue knowledge and skills, so that they can give more input and more voice to the negotiation proposal and to the process. And the second innovative things about this process is that we managed to have some brands on board, like H&M and some 3 other Dutch brands supporting this process. And one commitment from brands is that if the negotiation process lead to some cost increase for supplier, for example, better wage is provided or better food is provided for workers, they will sit down and have discussion with the suppliers on how to tackle this cost increase as a shared responsibility. And I think this commitment is very important because you know, it managed to have supplier and brands to have better dialogue, you know, really understanding, you know, what kind of improvement need in order to reach a common goal of having the better collective bargaining agreement. And throughout this process, you know, they made effort to discuss with each other, to learn from the factory situation, to learn more about the workers and trade union view. So I think all the stakeholders learn something and gain some benefit from this process. And for suppliers, they see a big incentive because the brands are working together with them in this, you know, challenging and difficult journey. And from the trade union of Vietnam, they also learn a lot when they work with the brands in this process, because they can, you know, really understand how brand purchasing practices are impacting on working condition. And in the case for the trade union in Vietnam, they plan to pilot several dialogue with brand sourcing from Vietnam so that the two parties have a bit better understanding and, you know, can better facilitate the social dialogue at workplace level. So I think that is a very important development in the industrial relation of Vietnam, because, you know, over the past 90 years of establishment, the National Trade Union of Vietnam did not have any direct contact, you know, dialogue with brands before. So I think with this, you know, important challenge they are facing with, both the supplier and the trade union work together, try to, you know, to have dialogue with brands on, you know, what's happening in Vietnam and, you know, what can be done to, you know, lessen the negative impact on the workers. So I think that's very important change taking place right now.
Thanks, Nguyen. It is extremely important. It's fascinating to hear how the trade union movement is evolving to match the force of global supply chains, essentially, because it's a sort of slightly older model, isn't it? And now we need to find new ways to confront some of the issues that we're facing. So it's really inspiring to hear about the work that's being done to address that. Now we have very limited time, thanks to the very good contributions from our panelists. So I'm just going to go to the Q&A. Interestingly, the vastly most popular question is related to this issue in some ways, because it's about how we follow through to link responsible purchasing practices to fair wages. So how we can really ensure that some of the developments and the improvements that we're seeing with responsible purchasing flow down to workers. And that is a question that almost 10 people would like to hear answered. So I'm going to invite anybody who would like to comment on this to come through and share some ideas on how you can ensure that this is done. Who would like to go?
I mean, if you don't mind, I will jump in first, and then
I think you'll all have something to say. So let's start with Fatima, and then Wilco also unmuted, and then Anna looked enthusiastic. So let's go in that order. Over to you, Fatima.
I think it's a legitimate question in the sense that the worry is that if you pay higher, the worry and the perception is that most of the money goes into the owner's pocket, which actually is not true. Is not always true, and is not always fair to the owner of the company. Because basically today, one of the good practices that we see is the open cost discussion between buyers and manufacturers that allows to see exactly what could be a fair price to be paid for a certain order given the actual cost. And maybe one way to ensure that the money actually goes to the fair wages to the workers in the factories is again through the audits, for example, because then you make sure that the owner complies with the domestic regulations in terms of minimum wage, in terms of social security, and so on, which is something that is done today. But given the situation and the vicious circle in which we are today, people find ways to cut corners and stuff like that, and this has to change. So maybe I think there are ways today to confirm that paying a fair price for an order implies the workers at the end of the value chain getting a fair wage, a decent wage for their work.
Thank you, Fatima. Wilco, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a couple of things. I think what first is important, of course, is that you agree, both of you, so supplier and brand, that you want to move towards higher wages, right? So in that you're both fully committed to that purpose. Secondly, I think it's really important to take each other's interests into account as well. And the fact that the supplier doesn't always want to more open up on, for example, their costs is understandable, right? Especially if you take it longer term, you know, if they lose the customer or whatever, what happens to them. So it's really important to start addressing this. And there is a methodology in place. You can, for example, use the Fair Price app, which you can find on the website for the Fair Price app, where we talk about labor minute costing, where you only open up on your labor costs. So not the other costs, but only on the labor costs. And then you start to calculate with the labor cost how much the price increase should be. And then thirdly, what I think is important, what Fatima is also referring to, is basically the verification part. So is it actually trickling down to the workers? And that you also agree together, so how we're going about on this verification part, and how can we do this together to make sure that the money ends up in the pockets of the workers. I also want to emphasize again the point of trust, you know, so I think there also needs to be some level of trust, of course, in the supplier. If you agree that this is a road you're both embarking on, that it's not like, I want to check whether it's not ending up in your pocket, but in the pocket of the workers. Now, you want to see, like, are my contributions helping, and are they coming towards the workers, and is that enough, or is it not enough, and do I need to do more or not? That's a slightly different approach, but a very important accent, I would say.
Anna, over to you, please.
Just one last point. I mean, I nodded heavily, I think, to all of the points you guys just made. I think this is exactly what you just said, Wilco. This is where the power dynamic between brand on the one hand and production partner on the other comes into play heavily, especially when we talk about things such as open costing. And trust, of course, is very important. I think what we did, for instance, we kicked it off by having our social auditing tool that we use feature a wage ladder, where it's really clearly visible what the minimum legal wage, but also the minimum wage paid at the factory, and then again the gap to the living wage factor is at the factory. So for everyone to see as well, what is actually the big gap and what do we need to tackle. And this really creates the basis for our common understanding, and then also for our common joint remediation talks, as I mentioned earlier. And I think it's also very important to involve really anyone in that discussion, not just the management at the factory, but also worker representatives, also a purchasing team, to really make them all understand that gap. And as you said, Wilco, have a joint goal to close it, and to really have a joint understanding of where we want to go with this.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. Now, I just would like to send one more question round with brief answers, please, because we've just got 5 minutes, really. Another very popular question, which I think is really important at the moment, is, do you think the new EU mandatory due diligence directive will help to ensure a wider uptake of the tools available for more responsible purchasing practices? Wilco, I know you've been very involved in the lobby to include responsible purchasing practices in the EU directive. So perhaps, do you want to say a couple of words about that, please?
Yeah. First and foremost, I hope so. So first, let's hope. And so it's only right now it's in the European Parliament, so it still needs to be negotiated between the Commission and the Council as well. And there are still a lot of questions like what will it look like in the end? But there are clear stipulations on purchasing practices, and that brands need to assess them. And also include them in their measures, basically. When it comes to human due diligence, they also need to look at the purchasing practices. So if that's basically this becomes the standard, then of course it's quite easy for the garment industry to refer to such a thing as the white paper of SCTI or the common framework and say, okay, but this is what we understand with common purchasing practices, and this is what they should be doing. And if you're not doing it, if you go below it, that's not responsible anymore. So I think that could be, yeah, absolutely. I do see that the legislation could definitely help in promoting purchasing practices even more, and having brands, besides looking at the situation in factories, also look at themselves, like how are we impacting our supply chain? Yeah.
Thanks, Wilco. Yen, I saw you unmute and then mute. Would you like to come in on that point?
Yeah, actually, yeah, I agree with the other panelists. I just would like to add comments on the role of trade union in this process, because it's very important, I think, to invest in capacity building for factory level trade union people and worker representatives, so that they can raise their concerns. Because as I mentioned earlier, the gap between brand perspective and the worker perspective is still very big, and so without very effective social dialogue at workplace, I think it's not the grievance handling mechanism cannot work, because workers, similar to suppliers, they will fear of retaliation when they dare to speak out. So again, coming back to the traditional approach of social dialogue, we need to have good system of social dialogue at workplace to enable other things to take place. And get back to the human rights due diligence. So production country have high expectation on the tools, so that brands can have more shared responsibility in human rights due diligence and working condition for the workers, and but also they are concerned that the cost for human rights due diligence will be back on the supplier rather than will be actually handled by the brand. So in the case of Vietnam, we are working on knowledge sharing, and training of trainers for the local stakeholder here, so that they can better understanding what the requirements of the law to the brands, and what role suppliers and trade union and worker can play in this process, so that when the implementation is actually taking place, the workers and the suppliers, they can play a more constructive and active role in this process, rather than a passive role right now, waiting for brand to tell them what to do and what should not do. So again, back to the very traditional approach of social dialogue, like Olivia, you mentioned before, is under big pressure, and we need to work on together to lessen that pressure.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And with 1 minute left, I just want to ask Fatima quickly how suppliers are feeling, and is there optimism in the association about the upcoming EU law, or are people feeling like they're not being consulted, or what's the general attitude about the upcoming legislative developments?
Well, we were worried at the beginning, but then with the involvement of the various MSIs and so on, like Wilco mentioned earlier in the lobbying with the EU, we feel a little bit better knowing that the purchasing practices are now taken into consideration anyway in this big regulation. But we still are worried and want to raise a red flag, in the sense that we need to make sure that whatever is put in that regulation will not be shoved down the value chain to the suppliers and the workers. Everybody needs to take responsibility. Brands and suppliers should be held accountable for whatever comes out of this.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I just think it's critical, isn't it, that when we see this legislation coming in, we ensure that continuous stakeholder engagement and feedback, which includes workers, includes suppliers, includes all the stakeholders in the supply chain, remains a very central element to this. There are many more questions, which unfortunately we're not going to have time for, but please do feel free to email them to the industry we want. We're also just going to pop our website details and our email up on the screen. So thank you hugely for joining us today. I thought it was a really rich and interesting discussion, and it was a pleasure to be with you all. Please do follow us on social media. There are many more deep dives coming up on the different pillars and metrics in the industry we want. And of course, the dashboard will be updated again in 2024 so we can continue to track progress. So thank you everyone for coming today. Enjoy the rest of your days or evenings, and we'll look forward to seeing you again another time.